Hi everyone, and thank you for coming this evening to the final lecture in the AAXX 100 series in our centenary year celebrating 100 years of women at the AA. I'm Manije Verghese, I'm the curator of the public program, and I'm also a member of the AAXX 100 steering committee together with Eleanor Gorn, who's here in the front row. And as you probably know by now, AAXX 100 aims not only to celebrate the contribution of AA women over the last 100 years, but also to serve as a catalyst for a wider discussion about women in architecture. And it's a multimedia project that culminated this term with a major international conference, a collection of historical and critical writing, and a big exhibition that you can see across the way in the gallery as well as upstairs that closes on Saturday. So if you've not seen it yet, I encourage you to go now. But just then, moving to tonight's event, we're delighted to host this conversation on the architecture of family between architect Samaneh Moafi and geographer Melissa Fernández. And they've each been looking at the social structures of family and their spatial implications across very different contexts through the lens provided by their respective disciplines. Governance through housing in Iran is the focus of Samaneh's PhD here at the AA, and the ways in which women adapt and assimilate their homes in their day-to-day practices of dwelling. And Melissa's research has looked at the transformation of social housing regimes in Puerto Rico and in Brazil. And tonight she's going to focus mainly on Puerto Rico, but she's happy to discuss her work in Brazil, she said during the discussion that follows. So they'll each do short presentations, and then we'll follow that with a conversation that's chaired by Léopold Lambert, who's the editor-in-chief of the Funambulist magazine. And that's for sale after the lecture in the Satsuri room. And there's also going to be some drinks, so I encourage you all to stick around and have some conversation with us then. And both Melissa and Samaneh have contributed to the Funambulist in the past, so you can buy the issues they contributed to as well as the current one. And anyway, so to briefly introduce tonight's speakers, Melissa Fernández is a lecturer in urban futures at Lancaster University. Her work focuses on the social material home as a critical realm of inquiry, where historical desires, everyday life, and future aspirations intersect. Samaneh Moafi is an architect and researcher based between the UK and Iran. She's a PhD candidate, as I mentioned, at the AA, and a research fellow at Forensic Architecture. And in her work, she examines natural environments and realms of domesticity as apparatuses of governance. And Léopold Lambert is an architect and, as I mentioned as well, also editor-in-chief of The Funambulist, which is a print, online magazine, and podcast dedicated to the politics of space and bodies. He's the author of 3 books and many articles about the intrinsic violence of architecture and its necessary political instrumentalization, in particular in Palestine and in the French colonial and post-colonial space. So before I hand over to Melissa, I just wanted everyone to join me in welcoming the 3 of them to the AA.
So thank you very, very much for this very kind invitation. I'm really, really happy to be here, especially that this is a women's forum, a women's series, and a celebration of women in architecture. I'm not an architect myself. I wish I were. But I'm just really honored to have been invited, so thank you. Right, so I have about 15 minutes. You might want to keep me to time. I'm going to be reading, so hopefully I will keep to time. What I want to do in these 15 minutes is to propose some ideas about the social architecture of family in relation to the work that I've done in Puerto Rico. And as was mentioned, I've worked in Rio de Janeiro as well, but I'm not going to be speaking to that. Happy to discuss it afterwards. What I want to do is think about how family forms and family typologies are deeply entangled in the production, manifestations, and imagery of housing spaces. So, to give you a very brief background about the context in which I'm speaking, in San Juan, Puerto Rico, I looked primarily at a contemporary case of social housing high-rise that is called Las Gladiolas, that you see here in the bottom, that was threatened with demolition and displacement. And this is Las Gladiolas, again, whose mainly women residents were also involved in multiple sites of activism, including a class action lawsuit against the housing authority. And in many ways, this case was not unlike the now emblematic battles that we've seen waged here in London, for those of you who are familiar, in places like the Aylesbury or places like the Haygate estate. So I was interested in the residential struggle, for sure, and I studied the residential struggle in depth. But I framed that struggle as part of a longer history of what I called othering, which was part and parcel of colonial hierarchies and urban development. Therefore, I was also working very deeply in the archives, trying to understand some of the historical colonial conditions that had impacted the production, but also this desire that was there to destroy the modernist social housing spaces. And what I learned, amongst many other things, was that in the production of these housing typologies and their suburban counterpart, which I'll discuss today as well, these were inevitably tied to the construction of the so-called Great Puerto Rican Family. This is a concept that was actually included in policy at the time. But in order to understand this kind of social architecture of the so-called Great Puerto Rican Family and how it seeps into what are current familial ideations within the nation, I think we need to take a step back and look at this concept of cultural nationalism. Basically, cultural nationalism emerged and was nurtured as a concept right around the time where Puerto Rico's status as a commonwealth was being developed also as a political concept and a practice. And during that time, the island's Creole, and Creole means kind of Spanish descending white intellectuals of the time, were trying to strike a deal with the Americans to renegotiate the island's fully colonial status at that time and turn it into what some call the light colony, which it is today. And that's obviously very debatable whether it's a light colony today. And in order to convince people that this kind of arrangement was a good thing, cultural reappraisals of the nation and of Puerto Rican identity were mobilized in two key ways. So firstly, a number of these very paradoxical policies were put in place that required islanders to, on the one hand, preserve their cultural identity as Puerto Ricans, so they had to preserve their language, they had to celebrate their local values, their customs that were seen as very, very distinct from the US. But at the same time, they had to deepen their political and economic ties to the US. So interestingly, they kind of managed to produce this fervor around a collective cultural sense of Puerto Rican identity at the same time that there was no political independence or economic autonomy, and that kind of continues until today. And the second way was by embracing within these cultural reappraisals the three supposed roots of Puerto Rican identity. And again, these ideas continue till today. One of those roots was the Taíno, or the indigenous Indians of the island. The second was the Jíbaro, which is this emblematic masculine figure of a noble highland peasant of supposedly European origin, and that's the figure that it's the kind of most romantic version of a pure Puerto Rican. And then the third is the African. And the idea behind this was to create an image of Puerto Rico and Puerto Ricans as a cultural amalgam of kind of conflictless harmony and integration, where we were all this one big, great family. And that is, in Spanish, la gran familia puertorriqueña. So this cultural and political family is very much founded on this myth of racial democracy, or the supposed absence of racial prejudice, even though what existed in fact was an ideology of white supremacy and black inferiority, and that's a kind of racial prejudice that is expressed still today in myriad cultural forms that are both explicit and subtle. So I want to, just to kind of bear that in mind, and what I want to turn to now in the context of this very particular kind of American colonialism that exists in Puerto Rico, is to think about the modern Western family and how that was constructed alongside concepts of homeownership and, by extension, the stigmatization of other kinds of housing tenures. And I'm going to expand on this in relation specifically to the suburban and social housing typologies that took shape more or less contemporaneously in Puerto Rico's post-World War II era, and where the constructions of homes as materiality and representations and colonialist thinking and American imaginaries of space and morality, all of these things together influence the social and material creation of the island's kind of urban and suburban order. Sorry, I didn't show that one. So we can start with this image. And what you see here comes from a document that was produced in the 1950s by the Puerto Rican government's Housing Investigation Board, which doesn't exist anymore, portraying a typical North American unifamiliar suburban home as a scientific reference point through which to speak about the island's emerging idealized home, which was also suburban in character. And amongst other things that this report said, it said that it should be both close to the center and embedded in an ambiance of quietness and stillness. It should have wide enough free spaces for future expansion and from which to isolate the household conveniently with trees so as to serve the rural touch and give feelings of exclusivity. The color and vegetation of the immediate surroundings should be taken into account to generate a sense of amplitude. And construction materials like plywood and masonite should be simple and inexpensive. So the specification here of materiality and of an environmental atmosphere were key, right? Because they allowed the government to combine what was understood at that time, which was a period of rapid industrialization, what was understood to be the rural migrant dream of access to a very modern urban life without losing this kind of little piece of land of the rural mountains where they had previously lived. And we see a very similar kind of message repeated here. And this was an educational strip that was produced by the Planning Board in the 1960s, where they were likening home ownership of freestanding suburban homes not only to personal satisfaction, but also to this national project of modernization. And we see here, on the right-hand side, the kind of white Criollo men who had dominated the top-down institutional urban planning board that originated actually in the 1940s, so they'd been around already for about 20 years then, leading the way into this kind of modern urbanity. And what you see here on the left is a literal kind of biblical Noah's Ark march towards progress, with the US space shuttle delivering them towards this progress. And you can see the racial triad, actually, of this great Puerto Rican family here, through the depiction of three particular figures in this line of people. So the shuttle itself carries this indigenous name of the island, Borinquen, not Puerto Rico. The sound of the local frog, coqui, is sounding in the background, so there is a kind of reference there to the mountains, but there's also a few men that represent the jíbaro at the back of the line with that hat. And then finally, you have this single black man at the end of the line. So this visual discourse combines the cultural nationalism that I described earlier with notions of American progress. And crucially, it also involves gendered images of middle-class decency that were supporting this kind of development, with the few demurely dressed women on the left and the wife that's supporting her city planner husband on the right. So here we can see gender, race, and the culture of urban order literally drawn out, and we can see the concrete entangling of internal colonialism, the politics of space production, and housing provision, all materialized in this kind of singular goal of a suburban family home tied to the mythical imaginary American way of life. But in addition to owning a home, homeowners were also meant to improve them, right? So here we have some images from the Puerto Rican magazine Hoy, also from the 1960s, that said that private properties must be improved because, quote, growing families required bigger houses, and, quote, more space is necessary for a more comfortable life. And the kinds of improvement projects that were promoted here included, and I'm only really quoting the most kind of gendered undertones, the ones that had the most gendered undertones, quote, preparing a store shed in the patio, including an apartment for grandparents, letting your kids have a room, adding a room to work on carpentry. In addition to this, I found other planning board documents that dated back to the 1950s that noted, quote, the family has to be able to live up to the standards of the housing itself, to count with the means with which to improve it so as to make it evolve. So this responded actually to an official policy at that time of the Housing Authority Agency that private property was an investment that protected families' futures through inheritance. That is to say that the success and the economic progress of this idealized family had to manifest itself through not just the purchase, but also the continuous care and the physical evolution of the individual home. And the residential design that was proposed to guarantee this kind of domestic bliss was based very much on the American home sweet home model and according to traditional social parameters and imperatives of family life. So in these documents, you find allusions to rooms that are meant to be for rest, kitchens that are meant to be for the female head of household, and hallways that are meant to be for privacy, etc. So within Puerto Rico's colonial context, this responded not just to the social transformations that were happening at the time, which were definitely happening particularly around issues of gender and work, but also to the growing moral anxiety regarding dark, poor bodies that would live inside these new suburbs that were being created. Specifically, during this time, as I mentioned, of industrialization and mass migration from rural to urban areas, the discourse of the so-called problem of slums emerged alongside the solution of public housing. And the figure of the racialized demon mother was popularized precisely during this time, seen as responsible through her overbreeding for the urban spectacles of poverty, for uncontrollable disorder and immorality, and I'm using words here that I found in official reports, which needed to be salvaged and literally kind of contained, as we see here, within a public housing structure. So public housing was created very much as a temporary measure, and a literal ladder that we see pictured here towards home ownership of a family unit that would extirpate the social difficulties and the ills of an inadequate and stigmatized slum dweller. And one of the ways that it would achieve this was by placing the actual projects next to middle-class communities, because the people from these middle-class communities were meant to educate, to integrate, and to elevate the cultural levels of the poorer families. And so here we have an image of a good family man, as the story denotes, moving his things, moving his children and his partner from a slum to a public housing project. The story also denotes that he has no money and no work, actually, but it doesn't matter because he has all these other features as a good family man. The other way that public housing kind of educated people was that it educated women specifically, orienting them on the roles as homemakers, teaching them to use new technologies, but also home economics. So the images that we see here are images of beautification of women, ordering bodies and improving them, really in a way legitimating the American colonial project, consumerist, middle class, colonial project of domesticity as the norm, and reinstating the figure of the woman as the housekeeper, the wife, and the mother, in case that had been kind of missed in the slums that preceded them. So what we get at this time is the creation of two opposing domestic kind of family women. One is the idealized suburban white woman straddling this hybrid line of American progress and suburban home ownership, with the traditional virtue of her feminine decency and the mothering practices also expected to improve the nation through a nuclear and reduced family model. The other is the creation of the aspirational public housing resident that was firmly grounded on the same middle ground aesthetic of the suburban private home, but underpinned always by the stigma of the slum. So a kind of failed cultural marker that then reappears and kind of is seen to stain still today the reputation of social housing as a supposedly failed national project alongside its criminalized depictions. It's really the lazy welfare mother that is the most reviled figure still today, projected as never surpassing her roots and therefore being stuck reproducing an inappropriate family model and threatening the health of a nation by consequence almost. So I'm just nearing the end, and I wanted to finish with, by jumping really, to show you two very contemporary images of what has been called an innovative social housing scheme in Puerto Rico that to me really demonstrates the legacy of this, the heteronormalcy of the American suburban home and the young white and middle class resident that it's always in a way has meant to be housing. So this here is a 2006 advert from a building that's called Metropolis, which was getting built just a few blocks away from the PHC site, Las Gladiolas, that I introduced right at the beginning. So this was happening exactly at the same time that there was this huge activist struggle around the demolition of towers that were not, were just a few stories less than these towers. But the argument that was given in that case was that residents had never really adapted, and the residents that lived there originally had come from slums, and the argument was that they'd never adapted to the high-rise typology, that their families never really kind of moved out of there in the stairway well that they should have, but also that they never really understood how to live in a high-rise. This tower, however, was targeting young, white, and wealthy heterosexual couples right around the same time, and these were the ideal residents that were imagined for this new gentrifying district. And the language in this ad is, of course, all about exclusivity, luxury, elegance, healthy, sporty living, and a suite of all sorts of personal services and conveniences that would come with it. And the racialization of the property typologies is very clear here, particularly when we contrast the typology of the social housing high-rise that's right next to this kind of whitened luxury high-rise. And it's a kind of whitening of luxury high-rises, I would claim. But as the housing crisis hit, the developers of this building went bust, and they were bailed out actually by the Public Housing Authority. So this was the very first time that a luxury foreclosed building was used for public housing. But when that transition was publicly announced, there was this massive popular outcry by the majority of the population. It was all over the media. It was very controversial. And it materialized in a number of ways, but particularly, to me, interestingly, through the production of this meme that was widely circulated in social media. And to me, this is a really interesting image because despite having that building, the luxury building in place, it's a completed disembodied image. You don't see people in it. And what we see instead are these clothes that hang from the windows, the horses, the bouncy slides. And these are meant to be sufficient markers, constructed in the media, of course, over the years, of social housing residents' cultural difference and their lack of discipline and class. It's about disembodied by bad behavior or its possibility, the possibility of failure, broken social and physical architecture combined kind of in one. So this mockery really activated long-standing stigmas related to public housing tenants and highlighted the long-lasting cultural unease with and fear of poverty that is tied to the public housing family in urban space, particularly around high-rise buildings. So that's the end. I wanted to finish with this image. It's very, very disconnected from everything that I've been saying now, but you know, it was really difficult to write up this talk and think about Puerto Rico and think about the legacies of, you know, the historical continuities of housing when just a few months ago we had Hurricane Maria and the island is entirely devastated and hundreds of thousands of people have lost their homes, either entirely or partially. And so I thought, you know, I should address the dislocations of this event and kind of mass outmigration and the family ruptures, actually, that have resulted from it. And what I find powerful about this image is, in a way, the overlay of the scales of the home. So the home here is seen as a domestic site. It's kind of a community because you can see a house in the back, and there's some kind of neighborhood happening too. There's, of course, a national homeland signified here by the flag. And the sign, of course, on this wooden kind of would-be door, I guess, which reads, in English, "You may have destroyed our home, but not our spirit and family." So what's interesting is not just the layers of the home meaning, but the sense in which family is understood to endure beyond the physical structure of the home, which sits on the same plane as this flag. And it makes me wonder kind of, you know, what family means in this context, what new homes and national projects will be created around idealized normativities in times of disarray, as they are now, and how, if at all, the fractures in space and social relations will be managed and reconstituted along similar or dissimilar lines to the previous racialized and gendered imaginaries of family and progress. Okay, thank you.
I don't know how to follow up. That was such a great talk. That was amazing. And I think there's a lot of lines that I will echo. And I think it will be a great discussion afterwards. So I'm looking forward to it. What I want to do today is to tell a story of two walls. One from about a couple of years ago, one from the 1970s. One that is removed, one that was built. One in the city of Isfahan, another one in the region of Desful, both of them in Iran, both in a domestic unit, both a domestic unit that is part of a kind of a national housing program. And I want to frame these mundane acts of moving a wall or removing it as signifiers of resistance, local kinds, and I'm most definitely not talking about grand revolutions, but nevertheless, firm responses to forms of domination. And I want to begin by this image, this house, and I want to begin by this space that I've kind of marked in red. And I want you to kind of, and the story that I'm going to tell is about this wall, this weird wall that is half separating the kitchen from the living room. This photo is taken from the same space. So you see the space for the kitchen in the back, you see the weird wall here, and the kind of living room is in the forefront. The woman that you see in this image is Mahsan. She was working, she had a full-time job at this point. She was an assistant to an attorney, a public attorney. She wasn't making that much money. She was herself from a working class family, and she was explaining this work that she was doing as something that was more of a necessity than something that is liberating for her, in the sense that, and she was very, she was telling me how she felt very unsafe at work, in the sense that there were cases of sexual assault that she couldn't really tell anyone because it was a public attorney office, like they were all, as in they were related to the state somehow, her bosses. And also she couldn't quit her job because she needed the money, to buy a house so that she could marry her fiancé. And this is her fiancé. His name is Mehdi. He had studied social sciences at university, but then afterwards he couldn't really find a job that was suited to his degree. And so he found this weird job. It wasn't really paying well enough. And so he couldn't really buy a house with his income, and he couldn't ask his father, who is standing on the side, because his father was also from a working class family. He was a cleaner. And therefore they were kind of like dealing with this weird situation. If only they had a house, both of their problems would have been gone, I was told. Mahsan wouldn't have to experience sexual assault anymore because she was given what she was saving up for, a house, so she could quit her job. And Mehdi didn't have to worry about his low income anymore because he was already given what he was saving up for, a house. And this line of thought is of course very problematic. But I want to invite you to put yourself in their positions and think how this could kind of make sense, right? This idea that if I own a house, then I'm suddenly part of a middle class, then I suddenly don't have to do these things that I'm like doing as a working class member, kind of a thing. And they were given a house. The house that you saw them standing in was a Mehr house. Mehr is a state-initiated project of housing in Iran launched in 2007 by the former president of Iran, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. Mehr, the name of the house, and in turn the name of the project, translates to English as compassion. The house was therefore to act as a gift of a compassionate state to the working class. A gift, but also a tie, a strong tie that entangled the residents with a power structure to receive and to reciprocate. Now I will support my state, who has given me a house. There were supposed to be 4 million of these houses to be built. Not all of them, 2.3 million were built, but that still houses something around 8 million individuals. These houses were built in the form of settlements, positioned far away from the city. In each settlement, the houses were very similar to one another, and this idea of sameness was important in the sense that we are all given the same gift. We all kind of are in the same position to the state. The houses, these settlements had a particular morphology in the sense that all of them were only composed of housing. There was no kind of shared equipment that would allow a form of a community to be formed, the sense of a common, as in there was no possibility of a common interest that was not supposed to be harnessed. It was the building of this shared equipment was postponed to a later date. The idea was to just build the houses and give them out. And these houses, these settlements were distributed in the territory in a particular way. So I'm looking at the region of Isfahan here. This is a drawing so that you can kind of see a bit more clearly where the city is in the center, and there is a river that is passing through, and there is these small villages around this area. These are the distribution of the Mehr settlements around the city. The red line here is showing the municipal borders of the city. And so all of them were kind of positioned within a 30-minute distance from the city. This is an isochronic drawing, and each contour line is showing areas that are within the same distance to the center And so this red is showing the 30 minutes kind of contour. Now, I want to come back to this house that I showed you earlier. There was another twist to this story. To be eligible for a mayor house, the applicant had to be the breadwinner of a family. But not just any kind. He had to be a male breadwinner, a son, a father, a husband. Again, not all male breadwinners could apply, only those who had failed in acquiring a secure roof over the space of their families. Through the gift of mehr, this gendered, failed breadwinner could regain his patriarchal legitimacy in the context among the people who were supposed to depend on him. And to deserve a house of mehr, men and women had to conform to this gender role. Men were to be depended on and women to depend. So the architecture of this house, this gift, was to secure, on one hand, reciprocation, the feeling of indebtedness to the compassion of the state, and on another hand, a kind of these gender roles, right? And a familial patriarchy in a way. And it's very clear in the organization of this house, right? Because we have the kitchen where, because although this is a very small space, the kitchen is not an open kitchen in the sense that the kitchen is a space for reproductive labor and it's performed by women, and therefore it has to be separated from the space of the living room, as in the space of cooking is separated from the space of being cooked for, the role of serving is separated from the role of being served. But the first thing Mahsan does when coming to this house is removing this wall. She argues that, I mean, she frames it in a different way, of course. She says that, you know, I always wanted to invite all of my in-laws in my house. And I told my fiancé that, you know, this is such a small space, I can't really do this, you have too many family, so we have to really remove this wall, and all of the people who have this, who are living in the same apartment and have the same unit are removing this wall, and therefore we should kind of do it. Right? And after that, she does something else to make sure that this space is not becoming an entirely a space for reproduction. She puts the most ornate elements of her dowry, her jahaz, say the vases, the china plates, the mirror, all of these things around the kind of like framing this space. So the space is more of a kind of a living room than it is a kitchen. That's her way of securing the space. I've looked at several of these examples through my research, and I'm not saying that I saw similar practices among, as in there were similarities between them. No, they were quite individuated, these practices. But each one of them was a response to a form of domination that the residents was experiencing, I would argue. This is a case where they didn't really have money to buy chairs or as in proper chairs, but the resident was she really wanted to kind of like have this ornate thing on the wall and have this golden curtain on the back, and so have this feeling of this kind of like a claim to a middle class maybe that she wanted to claim. Again, the similar case here. In this case, they were from a little bit, they were kind of like an upper working class, and you can see this beautiful vitrine at the back, and the woman was telling me this story that, you know, I mean, usually these vitrines are showing the dowry of a woman, and she was saying that, well, this is not actually my dowry, this is the stuff that I bought myself because my dowry wasn't good enough. And you know, a dowry is something that represents the class location within which a woman is brought up. So this is a gift that her mother gives her, and it's a representation of what was the context that she was kind of like growing up in. But so she was saying that, you know, that didn't represent who I am now. This is who I am, and I want to kind of like reorganize my space in a way that represents my location now, who I am. I want to, if there is a little bit of time left, I wanted to kind of like come to this another example that I want to show from the 70s very quickly. It's a different project. It's for, we're looking at south of Iran in ndez. This is a case for industrial farming. The idea was to build this dam and then build new settlements in this area so that the area will be farmed. This is what the area looked like before. So the water, it's a wetland condition, so the water would kind of rise up and the houses would be kind of like taken over by water, but then the residents would rebuild the houses, and there was this act of rebuilding your house as time would go on. This is the structure of the households at the time. So you have one man with the 3 wives living in the same household. You have one man and the 2 sons with their wives living in the same household. So it's a very complex kind of a structure, and and the house shows it. So the idea was that each one of the women in the household would own a room of her own, and then all the men were to dwell in this one room together. And this room was a bit higher, it had beautiful surfaces in the inside, but then at night the man would go to the woman that he's sleeping with, and this is a case where a man has 3 wives, right? So so it was a way of kind of conflict management, but and it was a way for this household to survive, and the order of the house would change through time as the family would evolve, and a few of these households would form a village. There was something like 100 of these villages in the territory, and they related to one another and to the territory in a particular way, in the sense that there was several rituals that allowed them to relate to one another. One of these rituals was it was a Shia ritual mixed with folk kind of things. Parts of this ritual is still performed in Iran. So for 10 days, upcoming to this one day, for 10 days, people in the village would be cooking for each other. So households would take turn to cook for the entire village. And then at this point, at the 10th day, everybody from across the village would do a procession to a sacred site, and there men would take off their shirts and they would start beating themselves harmoniously, according to this folk song that somebody is singing. And the anthropologist Grace Goodall describes this ritual as something that is not necessarily sacred so much. It is a series of acts performed in a specific order that allows people to relate to one another, to relate to their territory, and kind of like understand it. Otherwise, they didn't have the means to do so. This was the very means to do so. All of this had to change with this industrial farming scenario. So the 100 villages had to be destroyed. 13 shahraks, 13 of these new towns were to be built. This is what each one of these new towns looked like. So you had houses aligned in a grid, you had institutions in the center. One of these institutions was, of course, the mosque. And that was important because the village didn't really have a mosque. A mosque belonged to a city, which is a larger kind of a population. And this mosque was to act as an institution. You would no longer need to perform a ritual. This would be a place to kind of like do your prayer and have these kind of like sacred things that you would do. And it will all be kind of institutionalized from now on. Another institution there is the institution of school, but I don't have time to kind of like talk about it much, but there were also a set of gender roles that were introduced through the school to children. They were taught to children. But I want to come back to zoom into the scale of the housing. This is a drawing that Grace Goodall has of the area, the way that these houses were kind of like cross-shaped. And so that is one unit of housing. And you can imagine how problematic it is for a household of that complexity that I showed you to be broken up so that it can fit into this thing, into these 2 rooms. The space was also, it had a yard, and the yard had to be open to the street. And the idea was that the authorities would be monitoring the space, and if you're not taking good care of your house, as you were kind of like saying some of the stories, then you would be fined, and so that was the kind of a rule. Now, something strange happens here, Grace Goodell says, and that's my last slide that I'm going to show. The residents will start putting things that look like garbage in their yards, as if exhibiting it. They kind of like, not one household, but all the households within the town will start doing it together. It's a very mundane act. It's like, it's not, I'm not doing a revolution or anything. I'm just putting garbage in my yard. And the authorities will start saying that, okay, we're going to fine you again and again, we're going to jail you, and it's not really working. They do philanthropic things saying that it's really not healthy what you're doing, and like so on and so forth. But then at the end, what they have to do is to change the law and say that everybody has to build a wall in front of their house so that from the outside there is an appearance of order and you can do whatever you want inside your house. And so that's where I want to end. So the story of a wall that is removed and a story of a wall that is built, and the possibility for it, and the possibility of looking at these as acts of resistance.
Okay, so that's now when I realize that I get to orchestrate a conversation here when I'm still sort of flabbergasted by such an interesting thing to think about, especially in the case of Samaneh. It's not exactly what you had written in the magazine. So it's actually brand new material for me. So. I just had literally 10 seconds to think about it. Well, maybe I'll take a minute first to say how incredibly happy I am to be here, and I'm organizing quite often some events with contributors like that, but it's the first time that someone does it for me and is generous enough to invite me to be part of it. So I'm very, very flattered, honored, and happy. And man, this is hard. Well, okay, let me maybe put it this way. I think what was interesting, and I'm sorry to bring it back to the phenomenalist here, but I guess that's my cue to make it work. What was particular about the two issues in which Melissa and Samaneh wrote was that they were consecutive, and they were, even though they definitely did not carry the same name. The one that Melissa was part of is called Islands, and the other that Samaneh was part of is called Architecture and Colonialism. Both of them very much engage with architecture and colonialism. So the Islands one was actually Puerto Rico was really the biggest island of all. Like it was really mobilizing some very small geographies, what a Caribbean philosopher Edouard Glissant would call the small countries, with and the importance of the small countries, and talking about decolonizing struggles, indigenous struggles, demilitarizing struggles, and so. So what I really, really love about those two papers in those two different issues that actually form two volumes of the same story somehow is how we are dealing with an analysis that brings feminism and decolonial struggle together. Maybe in the case of Samaneh, maybe not quite as directly as in the case of Puerto Rico, for the good reason that Iran was not colonized per se. But maybe actually a good way to start the conversation would be maybe to ask you if you could tell everyone what the article was about, and in which way do you relate it to what you just presented, which was absolutely fantastic.
Sure, yeah. In the article that I was doing for you, I was looking at a case in Isfahan. It was part of the project of the 70s that I showed later on, and it was a case of women who were moved from a shared courtyard house into these kind of like, it was a philanthropic project. It was built by the Point program, the American Point 4 program, and they kind of like look like these suburban houses. And they were a means. They were only given to the factory workers, to the male factory workers. So again, it had some similarities with the case of Mer, as in they were only given to men, and you as a woman would only have this house if you were kind of like related to men. And back then there was a whole kind of like infrastructure that has to be built, as in people would make marriage certificates on the spot so that they could apply for these houses. Like maybe they didn't have a marriage certificate as such, but I really looked at it as how it was breaking the effect that it had in the way women lived. In the sense that, yes, the shared courtyard had so many problems, in the sense that, you had, I don't know if you've seen the courtyard plan, right? I'm sure you've seen the plan of it, as in there's a courtyard and there's rooms around it. In the case of a shared courtyard, each one of the rooms is owned by, as in it's occupied by a different family, and they're all from a working class, and they're all, or, even lower than working class. And so it was very problematic in the sense that, you didn't really have a privacy, everything was bleeding between the rooms, you would hear everything, but it also allowed for a kind of a solidarity between women, because they were the ones who were usually at home and were always outside, and this kind of like courtyard brought them together. It was a space that they shared the stuff that they were going through. If their husband was beating them, they knew that the other women they're gonna hear, and they're gonna come and stop the fight somehow, as in these kind of like these kind of small things. But then when they were moved to the American kind of lawn houses, very similar to the ones that are shared here, it was the inversion of a courtyard house, in the sense that the yard is outside, it is the space between two units, you're not sharing anything with other units, and if you are a wife and a mother of a family, then you're alone. There's no one that you can talk to. You're in this space and you're alone. And so so there was kind of like certain ideas of how you should be living that were communicated through this project, but then also this kind of like this idea that back then in the 70s there was different types of these settlements being built in Iran at the same time. So that was built by the Americans, but then another case that I talk about there is built by the Soviet Union, by the socialists, and it's a totally different idea of what a household is, and this one is built by the Americans as well, but not in a philanthropic way, in a kind of industrial kind of industrialization and modernization kind of a way. But so, it was never, the thing is, Iran was never colonized, but the architecture was a means for enforcing these forms of life into people's, as in, this is a new model, you have to live like this. Not in an authoritative way, but once you move in, this is how you should, it encodes.
Can I interject?
Yeah.
So, that's super interesting. So it's like this, there's this, with the change of the architectural model, there seems to be always a kind of shift towards an imposition, kind of top-down imposition of a new form of family, or a new form of sociality. So these two things are kind of put together in the different cases that you've mentioned. So I'm wondering how, because that obviously is also the case when we're thinking about the movement from the slum to public housing in the case of Puerto Rico. That's exactly the kind of break of old solidarity networks, the kind of collaborations that used to happen and that you could find in oral histories about communities, and kind of extended familial networks that were really broken up by this new typology, which of course then generated a new kind of sociality and new kinds of networks, and that has evolved over the years. So it's not that, sociality stops, it just transforms into something else. But I'm wondering about your first case also, this new social housing project, because that reminds me of the Rio de Janeiro mass social housing program that also attempted to build millions and millions of these units, very much for communities that were displaced, mainly from favelas. And again, one of the strongest critiques there has been around the breakup of old forms of solidarity, old kinds of communities, and indeed changes in family structures in many ways. So I'm wondering how this more recent case, in the case of Iran, how it is also representing some kind of imposition of a new model, because you described the individuals involved and the women and how they're changing the walls, but what are they coming from, in a sense, and does this project also represent, physically and socially, some form of radical change in what they used to live?
The thing is that I would have loved to be able to do a kind of a study of that, but I never got to. But what was clear for me was that many of the cases I looked at, they were people who got married through the house. As in, they wanted a house and they wanted to get married, and so the two of them kind of happened together. So the change of life for them was, in a way, a change from being a daughter of the house to become the wife of the house. So there was like this kind of changing of a role as well, and then I'm gonna have my own home now and do something else. I really wanted to, and what was striking for me was this feeling of empowerment that I saw in these women, because say with the case of 70s that I looked at, and also it's a question that about research methodology and how did you I want to hear how you did it. But so in the 70s I've been relying on a lot of writings by anthropologists, which is always entirely negative. Yes, so it's based on written text that I've been looking at, whereas in this case, I had the opportunity to go and meet these people, and I mean, not on my own. I had friends who were kind of putting me in touch. These photos are by Farshid Nasrabadi. I want to say his name. It was a totally different experience, because yes, there is a kind of a domination that is imposed into the architecture, and it makes you relate and have a particular gender role and so on, but it also
empowers. Yeah.
Somehow empowers. I don't know.
No, I hear that. I mean, with the Metropolis, the very last building that I showed, that was a very, very short study, actually, that I did about, how that came about, because it was very current when I went there a few years ago, and I managed to speak to some residents and take pictures of the apartments. And in fact, it was something very similar to what you're describing. So the women, I mean, for different reasons, the residents there were feeling very disciplined because it was a new kind of social housing project. Within this luxury building, the rules of governance were very different from the usual social housing rules of governance. So they were, in a way, policed much more than the typical social housing resident. The levels of kind of cleanliness, the access that they had to common areas was much stricter. And they were feeling that, and they were able to kind of recite the rules of engagement, and they knew what they were not meant to be doing. And yet, when you went into these flats, you have something very similar happening, particularly with the women, where they were kind of screwing the rules. So it's something different, right? But that what they were doing what they wanted to do. They were making the space their own in exactly the ways that they were not supposed to. And the reason that they were not supposed to do those things is because if they did, those things signified again that they were not orderly or they were not proper residents, and they were kind of reclaiming that and saying, no, we're going to do this, and this makes it home, and we kind of don't care what you're saying. So there was also a kind of resistance and an empowerment there in those acts. So I think I see in a way what you're saying.
And there is also this these layers of policing that is, I mean, not in this case, but in the case of in some of the cases that I've been dealing with, there was also, so there was the idea that you have the authorities who are policing the settlement in the sense that it's looked after, but then also the woman's new gender role is to police her family, to make sure that the guy is going to the factory and coming back in time, and the rent is paid on time and so on. So there is kind of like these layers of policing as well that is happening. But maybe you could talk a little bit about about the architect, or who made these plans, because you never talked about it, really.
The ones that for Las Gladiolas, so the ones that, there were a series of architects that were associated to this planning board. So they were Puerto Ricans that were mainly educated in the United States. So there was this kind of traveling typology, colonial typology, again, kind of brought from the US. Interestingly, the way that suburbia was kind of designed and imagined vis-a-vis the American model was through a Uruguayan architect that at the time, I can't remember his name now, he'd made a name for himself in the US, and the Puerto Rican government hires him to come and do this kind of city suburban plan. So most of the kind of designs that you see at the time are of this Uruguayan, who, of course, has a kind of sensibility for Latin America, I suppose, or Latin American cities, but is trained in the United States and then brings that model to Puerto Rico. But what you have mainly are local architects. The architects that designed Las Gladiolas, so the building that was eventually demolished that I studied, were the same architects that designed a series of about, very much actually like here when we think about the Aylesbury and these kind of projects that were built by local authority architects in the 70s. So there were architects that were hired by the government and that designed and then built this kind of series of high-rise social housing right at the beginning, right at the cusp, when they were still seen as a modernist kind of solution and very much in a positive light. So that's the kind of course, male architects, and that's the kind of design context within which it arises. I actually don't know who the architects of the luxury ones were. I didn't inquire that with the developers. So yeah, I'm not entirely sure.
I have a question for you.
Yeah, well, go for it. Okay, all right.
Funambulist has a particular agenda in itself, no? There is a criteria, I guess, that you have at the back of your mind, and so I wanted to know where does this question of gender sit within your?
It's going to be some.
Or what is the question
obvious,
of gender?
No, but Well, I think the important thing about gender in that case is both to dismantle patriarchy, but also heteronormativity. So I think something that someone I wanted to bring up in this conversation. If in an ideal conversation, I would still be sitting here, and instead of me, we would have another contributor of the magazine, Olivia Ann, who wrote a very, very similar article and creates an incredible dialogue with your two texts, in which she looks in particular at the suburban city of Levittown in Long Island, New York, and how at the exit of the Second World War, this type of town in the US was very much a technology of gender making. And here again, gender making as in really replacing women who had been in the workforce during the war, in the factories, who were sort of losing the characteristics that patriarchy wanted to see in women, and reassigning them in the very particular space of domesticity, in houses that were accessible only by car, in sometimes families that only own one, and obviously driven by the male part of this nuclear family. So she's looking both at that and simultaneously also how, a little bit like what Melissa has been presenting about the fact that it's also an extremely heteronormative space. So reassigning this gender onto female bodies is not just, it's not just about patriarchy, but also heteronormativity, and how there was this reassignation was also done with an imaginary of women in the workforce who were called lesbians or like having an entire homophobic imaginary brought to them. Mm-hmm. So what she's doing, which is absolutely fantastic, and you can see how I'm not speaking very well about it when she would be able to do much more better than me. But it's like you, Samaneh, she's really looking at the space itself and the micro scale of architecture in how it really is able to calibrates a gender relation in the space of domesticity and at large in a space of society, and I don't think saying, like most things in the Funambulist, it's not really about like denouncing some sort of conspiracy where everything is thought for one very precise agenda, but it's just that's the strength of normativity. That's what brings at the end those results. So anyway, that's a very convoluted way to answer your questions, but I really wanted to take the time to cite Olivia's work as well. But to answer your question, I think the Funambulist is very much in a perspective of intersectional struggle, looking with maybe a particular trope towards decolonialism, but in almost every sense of the term, even though I'm a little bit worried about it because we tend to want to decolonize everything now, and we tend to maybe forget actual colonial situation when we say that. But to look in general at how built environment is very much an instrument of power, for better or for worse. I mean, when it's pretty amazing to have your talk, you finishes with like building a wall as a form of resistance, which is pretty much almost everything I'm writing against in general, but it makes so much sense in that case. Yeah. And so it shows very well how it's not like, well, there are good walls and there are bad walls. It's like there are walls. It's a technology of power. It's like, but which power are we actually embodying in it? Is it the dominant power or is it a form of resistance? Is a real thing. So I think that's pretty much what the magazine is trying to do, to really not give good points and bad points to think, but very much insist on those technologies of power that architecture embodies in relation to bodies, which we are starting to do more and more in the architectural world, but quite not enough yet. So, I mean, I think that's why I was so amazed to have those two presentations.
Yeah, I think I just wanted to add there that, I think rightly so we're focusing on gender and we're focusing on women and women's bodies, but I think we have to also kind of recenter the racialized body. And obviously that's part of the decolonial impetus of the Funambulist, and I know in what you're saying and the works that you publish. And so for me in my work, it was impossible to think about what was happening from a feminist perspective and in terms of women without thinking about race in the context of Puerto Rico. And as I mentioned, the particularities of the racial determination of the nation, which was very unique and different to the United States or the American model of segregation. So the way that public housing plays out in the United States has to do with a different kind of racial configuration. And I think that intersectionality is also important to bear in mind when we're thinking about these physical architectural spaces. So one quick question was, because I'm thinking of race and gender together, and of course class figures into that, and I think your talk was really strong in relation to the class element. Yeah. And I think we discussed this before, but it's because I'm unfamiliar with the Iranian context, but how other kinds of forms of discrimination, of marginalization of particular kinds of Iranian bodies that are classed in particular ways, is there another segmentation of the body, of what is hidden, or of what those walls are trying to kind of keep behind, that's not just gender and class?
Yeah, I mean, there is also another layer that I feel is very strong, is religion in Iran, and different, so it works a bit differently to race, because depending on what religion you belong to, and also the degrees to which you align yourself with this religion, or you feel like you're religious, that then differs where you sit. In some cases, you have to perform as if you are a super religious person in order to be able to receive some of the welfare benefits that the state is offering, and at other times, you have to lie about your, so that is like a different kind of but also, what it brings to the surface is that, the practice of emancipation for women is different depending on which class you're from, or which race you're from, or what kind of a religion you hold, depending on your context. And sometimes what seems to be an emancipation for a woman at this context is not the same for the other one, because I had a problem with the case of Mahsan, where she was saying that I am working, but I don't really want to be working. And I was like, what do you mean? I mean, isn't working the thing that you want to do? And so and these are very local things that you have to kind of very much understand in a particular context what they mean, or how they translate. I also wanted to say something about decolonizing, because there is Adrian Lahoud, the Dean of RCA, he was giving a talk earlier a few weeks ago in the AA, and he was talking about the idea of decolonizing architecture, in the sense that we always think, as lots of us architects think, that a house is a house, a family is a family. This is a normal unit of dwelling. You live in. It's a family house, but in fact, it is a total construct. And if we go back in time, I mean, even now you can look into different models of dwelling that are coming out, depending on where we are now, the sharing a house, or so on and so forth. But if you go back in time, there are models of dwelling that have nothing to do with a nuclear family. And they work as a model of dwelling. They're as legit as anything, and somehow we've lost these differences sometimes in time. And so it's important to kind of go back and try to look at those and understand, in a way, decolonize the architecture of today somehow by going back and bringing those. That was what he was suggesting.
Maybe if I can plug in, my whole other area of research is actually on co-housing and alternative housing projects. And it's interesting you mentioned that, because I work a lot with architects in that context, and their co-design process with residents. And if you know a bit about co-housing, it's a strange combination of individualized kind of homes that very much mimic a traditional house. House is a house kind of thing, of an individual household, combined with these kind of collective spaces of collaboration and solidarity that are, in a way, trying to go back socially, politically, to a kind of commoning that was truer to other kinds of communities, perhaps in the past. They're also trying to mimic a kind of village feel. So there's many things that are, in a way, parochial about it, if you will, and there are other things that are quite revolutionary from the design perspective, and from the social and the political side. And I think the more interesting cases, probably design-wise, are the ones that are working with the people themselves in that process, and in a way questioning the models of family. So they're questioning how they want to live, both individually and as a collective. They will be living as a collective, but in that process, they're thinking with the architects about, what that means. How can we kind of create a space that breaks down certain barriers that we've come to accept as the nuclear family? And a lot of these models are really trying to challenge the nuclear family or the heterosexual family, and doing that in part, not fully through architectural practice. So they're very clear about not wanting to be architecturally determined either. They're a social unit, a collective, and they're about much more than the built environment, but the built environment is definitely key to how they're kind of reconstructing the notion of home and around a notion of collectivity and not individual living.
Perhaps it's interesting to think of architecture as well in when looking about architecture and ideology or the norm itself. Is like we know that it's not really the chicken and the egg, because we actually know which comes first, which is the ideology. But once it's started, so to speak, then we really have a self-fitting loop of how ideology inform architecture, which itself sort of implements spatial conditions for this ideology to really be embodied and incarnated. So I don't know. I always find that fascinating how those two works together, despite the fact that the eggs come first, so to speak.
Yeah. Should we open it to the floor?
Okay, try.
I
Go read my handwriting on my hand.
talk about bodies.
So it was mainly about this triangle of things, this constellation of elements and issues that I think circle around what you've been saying, and kind of speak about scale, I guess, or the scale or the moment in which a resistance or an enforcement happens. And again about normativity. So you speak about spaces and the as if it's something within a boundary somehow, and yet actually the moments in which something is enacted is often this, easily with Samaneh, it's this mediatory space of the wall, right? And then there's on the wall is threshold, blah blah blah, it encompasses all of that. And then the normativity happens within this neutral mediatory thing, and the act of removing this neutral mediatory thing is precisely the resistance against the normative kind of enforcement, right? But then I guess with your work, Melissa, it's to end on that disembodiment, to end with a space being albeit through catastrophe, and I don't want to indulge in that image, right? But that it is reduced to elements somehow, and it's taken away from being this space enclosed within an entirety. I think is quite interesting. Just as a reflection, I'm not sure how to turn it into a question, but I feel was. I also don't want to posture, but yeah, I don't know. And then also. Oh no, I can't read. Yeah, I'm going to leave it there. But something in scale, and I think quite a few conversations here and elsewhere in the past years or so has been on this scale at which something operates. In a problematic way as well. We're so bothered about where's that agency, and we do architecture and it somehow has a line around it and it's this imposed thing, and yet all the things we're interested in and all the moments in which we see an emancipatory potential actually is in a moment of disembodied potential or an element or something that's dismantled. So it's not a criticism, but there's something going on there that I constantly notice. That was it. And then it was if you spoke about elements and then you spoke about modules, also even projects that kind of speak about the emancipation, flexibility of a space. It's often by moving, the chance to move your element, right? Or to repeat your module. And that goes back to the gift, the equal gift. It goes back to loads of theorization of capital, right? I mean, it's chapter 3. Volume 1, it's all it's this somehow homogenization into a module that's somehow equal and somehow has the potential to be the mode, the vehicle of resistance, and yet is not the entire bound, it's not the whole space or something. I don't know. There's like loads going on there. I don't know if you'd want to say anything about it.
Yeah. It's kind of a semi-question. And like, firstly, thank you both, and kind of the thing for, I mean, also two interesting examples in which, you know, the case of Puerto Rico, where it's not kind of traditional colonialism, it doesn't fall in that kind of European expansionist kind of sentiment that we understand it, in Iran, in the case of it never being colonized per se. I was just wondering if you just go back to the wall of the kitchen, and that kind of, the reading of that, and the kind of, it's not a segregated space, right? Like, it's not closed, it's kind of partial. And so I was just wondering if you could elaborate on that as being a kind of, like, where is that moment where it becomes...
Like that.
All right. Yeah, just like, if you could elaborate on that, because it's not like, you know, in a traditional, if there is such a thing of a Muslim house, we have, you know, on the left, the women's, and the right, the men's kind of greeting area, or whatever. This wall is a partial wall, which then gets removed. And I was just wondering if you could, following that kind of train of thought, in your reading of that, being a kind of act of against that kind of patriarchy and distinction.
Okay, so the reading of a wall is something that it's talking about scale. The scale in which the wall operated was way bigger than the domestic unit and the family that it was in. And there is a layer of the story that I didn't say. In the beginning of the project, because these houses were really small, there was no wall separating the kitchens from the living rooms. That's what the developers thought would be the most economically viable thing to do, with no kind of gender perception. It was purely an economic question. Soon, there was a wave of criticism in popular media about the fact that the wall that separates the kitchen from the living room is the essence of Islamic architecture. In the sense that there are norms about mahram and no mahram, about what, about segregation of men and women, and obviously working in a kitchen is a woman's task, and therefore she has to be separated from the living room where the foreigners would come in, where there would be a foreign man in there, and therefore this wall is the very thing that separates and allows the woman to be separated from this foreigner. And so, and of course, this was not, this was a pure construct, as in you don't have an essence of Islamic architecture. It has changed numerously through time, depending on different contexts. The House of Muhammad was like basically 3 rooms and a big yard. There was no difference between the rooms. There was not even a kitchen in the house. So this is, and of course they had used this as a political means to question the entire idea of welfare that the president of the time, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, was putting forward. So then this wall, this weird wall, becomes something that allows you to like question an entire scheme of housing. And from then on, the Minister of Housing goes on saying that, oh, no, every house has to now have a wall, and however this wall is, you have to put some sort of a wall in there. And then, so this house was one of the later houses after this new law had came in. So it is in its, it's definitely not complete, but it's not complete because the space is too small to actually allow for it to be operate at that thing, but it was very much built because of the argument of this is something that is supposed to be Islamic and is supposed to like make this house Islamic and have the kind of like, with all of its constructed nature of things. So and for me then, looking at this removal of a wall, yes, for her, maybe it's more of like an emancipation in the local scale of this is how I'm going to run my own house from now on. But then if you think of it, if you think of why this wall was constructed, and then this woman removing this wall, you kind of it can be framed as something against this whole kind of like framework, this framework that is at the larger scale of what the gender roles are supposed to be. And so, and maybe she's not aware of it, and maybe it doesn't really make sense if it's one woman doing it, and if it's not conscious, but there's a project there, you know?
I was just going to add to the multi-scalar thing, because I think that is it's a really important thing, and in relation to studies of the home and critical geographies of the home, and specifically feminist critical geographies of the home, have been thinking for a long time now about the multiple scales and being able to read home, whether it's a wall or a room or material objects or a family unit, things that signify mean home well beyond, with the material and with the social, and then that kind of brings in all sorts of scales, but importantly also, crucially really, all kinds of temporalities, right? So I think there's something interesting in both of our talks that happen, I think, spontaneously, which is linking history to the present. And I think there's something about the multi-scalar and the multi-temporal, and somehow when you start to bring in these different scales, it's almost impossible not to think about the multi-temporality of it. So, in the case of Las Gladiolas, the community that was resisting the demolition, one of the things that often came out in people's description of what was going on in their activism and how they were resisting, and when they were talking about the meaning of their home, was to think about what their hallways used to be like, or what the community space in the towers used to look like, or what the painting on the walls that had been erected by a police state really in the 90s against social housing had looked like versus what they had turned them into. So there was always this memory temporality that was built into the way that they were making sense of the physical present and the social present. So I think it's also important to do that. And it's interesting, I was just at the AAA, the American Anthropological Association conference last week, and there was a session on urban anthropology and the future of urban anthropology and the debates of the future of urban anthropology. And one of the main things that they concentrated on was scale. So they were saying, actually, anthropologists have been in some way notoriously bad at thinking through scales, thinking collectively about scales, like very, very good at description, beautiful, thick description that in a way kind of intuits scale, but not thinking really explicitly about how these things connect. Yeah, and kind of saying, actually, an urban anthropology must be doing this into the future.
We probably only have time for one more question, so if anyone has one, now's your chance.
So it's big pressure.
Or not. Do you have a final question, Léopold?
Wow, talk about pressure. Nothing that would really create an organic sequel of what we've just been talking about. So.
Well, maybe I have a question.
Yeah, well, very well.
Please, since I have the microphone. I guess speaking of scale, both of you spoke about high-rises, like when you showed the mayor houses as a field condition, and then when you showed that last project where the luxury high-rise was saved from bankruptcy by public housing, and you both spoke about the high-rise as a place that, if badly designed, can remove all sense of community. And I was just curious if you could speak more about that as a typology, like when done badly, how it can actually destroy communities through its spatial design.
Well, I don't believe that. I mean, I'm sorry if that's what came across. I think what I was trying to say is that that's what the policy discourse is. That's what the government.
I didn't think you believed that. I just was curious about how to link.
Yeah. So definitely the high-rise, interestingly, and I've written about this, and this is true to high-rises and certainly social housing high-rises in many Western contexts, not just Puerto Rico. That kind of creation of a problem before, and then the high-rise as a solution, which very quickly turns into a problem again. And it's very easy to turn it into a problem because the people that you're housing there had already been constructed as problems to begin with. So in a sense, it was never about the high-rise, right? The high-rise was going to house whoever. It was about the way that the culture of the people living there was constructed. And what was key to the destruction of the story of high-rise, public housing high-rise as a solution was in saying that people did not adapt to that way of living, that somehow the physical structure didn't work, but they didn't work because the people didn't adapt, right? So it's not the typology, obviously. In a luxury building, those people learn how to live there. But if it's for the poorer people, then it is a problem. And what in fact you see, and I think anybody that has studied the people living in public housing high-rises, is that they do work, and they work very well as communities, and they do turn into communities. And there's all sorts of ways that people adapt those spaces, even if they are alienating at the beginning. A community of sorts and networks emerge, and the elevators are used in very particular ways, the stairwells. There's all forms of sociality that emerge through the particular high-rise spaces that become community spaces. And actually, those are the spaces that matter more than the top-down community space that's given to these buildings, right? It's these other in-between areas, and really people's apartments also, and importantly, the corridors. In the context of Puerto Rico, corridors were hugely important to the formation of communities and the maintenance of communities, so that when corridors became neglected and all of the kind of public spaces that the maintenance and the budget that went into maintenance is taken away, that's how you first kind of attack the community. It's by not maintaining those in-between spaces of sociality, which is never, of course, about the people or their power of adaptation or their community-making skills, but about budgets and policy, really.
I just wanted to say that there is, obviously you have good high-rise, good design, and you have bad design, and there's nothing specific about the high-rise itself is a critique to a high-rise itself only goes so far, because it very much depends on how things are designed. But I think one thing that the high-rise requires, as in it's inevitable, is that there are a set of shared spaces. There is the corridor, there is the stair, there is the elevator. There are spaces that are shared between a set of residents, and it's something that you don't necessarily have, say, in a suburban settlement or anything. And that's and the administration of this shared thing then is very important. Do you leave it to the residents? Do you ask your residents to take ownership of this shared space and figure out how they want to manage it, or do you make it a space, a means for policing who's living in these settlements? Do you become the authority who's in charge of managing this shared thing? So, and this is something that I think is very distinct to the high-rise, that it definitely has this possibility.
Yeah, it was more of a provocation, I guess, than a question, but I think in both of your responses, you talked about this idea of how social structures can remove some of these walls and create these shared spaces. So that's really interesting. Well, I guess if no one has any more questions, I guess we can wrap things up. But I encourage you all to stick around and get to talk to all of our speakers. And a big thank you to Léopold, who actually gave me the idea for this talk, and I'm really glad he could be here. And I hope you all have a chance to check out the magazine that he lugged over personally from Paris. Yeah. So please make sure to look at those, just so his efforts pay off.
Please don't make me go back with it.
But a big thank you to all three of you for a really thought-provoking and incredibly inspiring talk and conversation. So I hope this is the beginning of many more like it.
So thank you very much. Yeah.